Welcome, educators and champions of physical and health education. I'm Josh Reed, and I'm excited to be starting on this journey with you. Today's conversation explores land is pedagogy, Indigenous education from the perspective of Nipissing First Nation, with guests Daniel Stevens and Lacy Stevens-Farrel. Daniel Stevens is a citizen of Nipissing First Nation, a physical educator for 20 years, as well as the current Director of Education at Nipissing First Nation. We are also joined by Lacy Stevens-Farrel, a proud member of Nipissing First Nation and member of the Crane clan. Lacy assumed the principal role at Nbisiing in the fall of 2021. We acknowledge that the conversation today is possible because of the wisdom, traditions, and knowledge held within Nipissing First Nation. We are eternally grateful for the time, connection, and learning that Daniel and Lacy have shared with us as a part of this conversation today. Hi folks, welcome to the Physical and Health Education Canada podcast. First of all, thank you so much for being with us today. For the folks that are listening, just a little bit about yourselves and your personal journey and how you got to your role in education.
I began my journey in education later in life. This is sort of my second career, but I'm from Nipissing First Nation. I've been teaching at Nbisiing for the last 12 years. I returned to university when I was 32 and did my undergraduate degree, and then was very, very ambitious and worked very hard to just get all my additional qualifications so that I could be in a position that I could make some change. But I also think that I only started learning about residential schools in university, and I had no idea about my own family history and why my dad basically pretended he wasn't Indian. I thought I was Italian for most of my life. And it wasn't until I started learning about it and I started asking questions, and then he started telling me stories about his, how he grew up and how he was embarrassed and all those things. And then that just catapulted me into wanting to make change in education. And I just saw that as the best way of doing that. And knowledge is power. And my education is allowing me the ability to influence at a very local level with the students. And now in this role, it seems that I have greater influence. So that's basically my journey to being a principal.
Perfect. I really appreciate it. And Daniel?
My journey was a little bit more straightforward in that right out of high school, got into university, went to kinesiology, School of Kinesiology at Western, was heavily involved right at the get-go in terms of Indigenous education and some of the issues that were perpetuating themselves within the university at that time. Choices came about, and I'll be the first to admit, law was very appealing to me. However, all things considered, I ended up getting my Bachelor's of Education. And then, fortunately enough, got a permanent teaching position within the local area, within the local school board. Taught there for 20 years, at which point heavily involved with the Ministry of Education for curriculum development and review. I worked my way through the collective agreements and unions, federation work with OSSTF. I also considered working the Ontario Federation of Labour, the Canadian Labour Congress, Canadian Teachers Federation, bounced around significantly in terms of my involvement, but in the end, really always landed on Indigenous issues within the context of labor. Education was very important. I wanted to become a principal. I wanted to do very similar to what Lacy said, is affect change and put myself in a position for change. One of the big points that I always sort of position myself on is the fact that we always consider that students need to see adults in the room that are of themselves, and we never consider that adults need to see other adults in the room that are of themselves. So I worked hard to become a principal, and then the opportunity to become the director of ed for Nipissing, my home community, came up. And at the time, I was a band counselor. I was advocating quite heavily for our people on a federal stage. I had to step down from that position to take on this role as the director, and the rest is history. I've been in this role for 2 years, working with a phenomenal team, really making Nipissing at the forefront of education, not from a integrative process, but from a standalone, sovereign, independent perspective in hand with Canada, and making sure that Canada, Ontario, and other organizations understand that when they come to Nipissing territory, they are dealing with a nation in its own right, and it is not an extension of Canadian federal legislation. So,
Brilliant. Thank you for painting the picture of both of your journeys. Could you provide some context around how the two of you work together and kind of what that looks like?
my duty is a little different than what you would see in a provincial system. My responsibility is quite literally to those that are within my charge, and Lacy, as a principal, has people within her charge. So we really work sort of on a reverse scaffolding and a reverse hierarchy, where my responsibility is to be a support structure for Lacy 100%. It is not about any other responsibility. If I'm doing my job correctly, Lacy should feel supported, and vice versa. Lacy should feel supported by me. I should also feel supported by our chief and council, but then the teacher should be supported by Lacy. So the structure really is a top heavy, but not in the same context and not in the same corporate mentality that we see in the provincial levels, where top heavy often is higher ups or a hierarchy like a director of ed. For us, the director of ed is very much bottom rung for all intents and purposes.
Yeah, I would agree. Dan basically provides the support for me to be able to do my job, and that is supporting the teachers and really building capacity. And I talk to my other friends that are teachers and or principals, and the relationship that we have is not one that you would see in a traditional board school. Like if I have any concerns, I immediately call Dan. He's my first go-to. And I know at the end of the day that he'll back me 100%. But we have that relationship where we stay in touch, and we have a very good relationship in terms of if I need support, he's the first person I call. And that just filters its way down, right? The staff, because I feel supported, they feel supported. And it is a wonderful working environment that I think people envy.
Oh, absolutely. And as you're explaining that in my own head, it's that like inverted pyramid. The pyramid is flipped upside down. Really, like Dan, you explained it with that scaffolding and supporting. And I really appreciate you both sharing. So moving more into today's topic, but how does land-based learning fit into the broader educational umbrella within Nipissing First Nation?
Well, to be honest, I think when we talk about land-based learning, we're really talking about our traditional way of learning. This is a relatively new thing for most of Canada and most of the world, but this is something our people have been doing for thousands of years. And really what we're doing is infusing it into a modern context. So when we're talking about land-based learning, for us, it's really not land-based learning as a new methodology. It's a returning to our roots within a new context of things like curriculum, structured curriculum, structured coursework. These things are very new to us, but nonetheless, we have a substantial amount of knowledge that when our teachers teach, they're drawing from that heritage, that cultural perspective that is often sort of, I don't want to say mislabeled, but definitely misunderstood when it comes to what we actually are trying to propagate, which is, again, our worldview, our perspective. We are very cognizant that the provincial systems and the federal systems in other countries within and without Canada are designed to propagate their perspectives. In our situation, we are doing the exact same thing. We're just doing it our way, which seems novel, but really isn't. It's a very interesting dynamic and a very interesting time for us to be talking about these very difficult, very nuanced styles of methodology, because we've known of them, but we've never really attacked them in this sort of format. And Lacy is really great at motivating staff to become mobile and to propagate these ideologies to the staff, because the teachers we have, we don't need allies or advocates at Nbisiing. We need people who are going to be propagating our worldview, just like the provincial system needs the same thing. They need people who are going to propagate their worldview. So it's a very interesting dynamic.
Yeah, I think that we're very fortunate in Nbisiing because we're secondary school on reserve, and we're located right on Lake Nipissing. And like when I think of land-based learning and an Indigenous perspective, I think of land as pedagogy. Land is where the learning is. It is the learning, right? And you see how that presents itself as a school. And I just think about in celebration, in ceremony, in times of grief, happiness, we always find ourselves on the land. We are outside. We are building fires. We are celebrating. Our powwows are outside. Our sweats are outside. It is where our students go to heal. And it's just a natural thing, right? For our students, that's what they ask for. It's like if there's a loss in the community, Can we have a fire? We need to go outside. We need to spend time together. And I just think of all of the opportunities that the land provides. And it's an ongoing forever. It's never in isolation. It's not, we're just going to go outside and learn this. It is always present.
Lacey, I absolutely love when you called land is pedagogy. I think that's something central to today's discussion, is that we're really going way beyond land-based learning. Essentially, it's not that. And like you say, it comes in celebration and ceremony and grief. So in terms of the school context itself, how does land is pedagogy fit into the stereotypical school day as many of our listeners would view it?
On a regular day, because we are a ministry inspected school, this is probably our biggest challenge, is sort of finding that middle, messy, non-linear way of providing opportunities for students within that framework. I think we do a really good job, and it's really having those relationships with the students and listening to what their needs are and having community resources available. We have a lot of staff from the community, and we have a lot of community connections. And it's our immediate go-to is, who do we need to reach out to? What can we do? How is that going to work? Whatever we're doing, really, we reach out and ask for support in the things that we're doing. And we do have a large pool of resources that we can go to. We're very fortunate that way. And I think that's probably the biggest challenge a provincial school would have, is having access to elders, community language speakers, to, events already happening in the community that we can go to, also hosting events that we, that people can come to. We're very fortunate that way. We provide breakfast, we provide lunch, we have a drumming in the morning. The staff, we go by first names. It's as unstructured as it can be within a structured system, because we really do mirror a board school calendar and schedule and that kind of stuff. I think we do a really good job of making space when the need is there. If an opportunity comes up last minute for an event, we go. We figure it out. We change the schedule and it's like, yeah, well, this is happening. There's an elder in town, or, oh, a porcupine showed up at our back door and now we can dequill it. Can we get somebody to do that? Like, we just go with it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that. Been fortunate enough to have previous conversations with both of you, and I know from a conversation with Daniel that the teepee at the front of your school was gifted to you, and how you mentioned relationships and community, just how central to land is pedagogy, and really lean on that, and these opportunities that arise and the events and experiences, ceremonies. How central is your community, as a school?
You're exactly right. Like, what we do is everything is based around the idea that we are central. We're part of the larger picture of what education is. We know we are a component. We're not the end all be all in education. However, we do understand that we act as a bridge between our perspective, our worldviews, our the thousands of years of history, and what the 21st century is going to expect out of our citizens moving forward. We act as that bridge, and being who we are at Nipissing and being so close to urban centers, we would be amiss if we didn't consider that as part of our responsibility as well, because many of our citizens actually live off of the reserve. So we have to understand that we play that role to bridge that gap. But again, not at the risk of our perspective, our worldviews, our culture, our peoples, and their traditional ways and to view the world. That has to be maintained at all costs. So the opportunities, as Lacy said, someone drops off a porcupine. We shift very quickly because, like you said, it is an opportunity. One of the things that we hold very dear to us is that structures and systems are important. However, there are opportunities in life, and we have to be able to shift essentially at a moment's notice. That's what life is the ability to shift on a moment's notice to a new opportunity to learn. And again, Lacy has done a phenomenal job at the school to making that a very strong core value, especially with, we'll discuss it probably later, is that there are changes over in staff. There are changeover in management and direction, and it is the administration who sort of keeps the even keel, keeps the course. when these things change, because that's the most important part, because those students are with us for 4 years. We can't be changing direction every single moment there's a change due to unforeseen circumstances. So there's a shift for opportunity, but then there's also the ability to weather the storm, and finding that balance is very key. And I'll be honest, Lacy and her team at the school have done a phenomenal job at maintaining that balance.
So I'll keep that theme. Lacey, just kind of go to you on this one, is around that balance. Maybe moving away from the topic slightly, but I think it's really powerful for listeners and in how you keep that balance. And I know that's a really broad question, and possibly with Daniel sharing earlier around that inverted pyramid and how that's helpful. But
I definitely think it comes from a leadership style that is based in humility. You know, I think about the seven grandfather teachings and how it's a non-hierarchical. It's not, and I even hate the title principal because I'm not the principal. I don't look at it as a role. I look at it as a responsibility, and I am very vulnerable with my staff and honest about the challenges that I'm experiencing as an Indigenous leader. And we do a lot of work as a staff, a lot of trauma work, and we do a lot of anti-racism work. And it requires a level of trust and willingness to be vulnerable together. And I think, you know, we're all going to make mistakes, but it's creating a space where the staff, because a lot of the staff is non-Indigenous, so, you know, there's always this fear of doing something wrong, and we work very hard to overcome those. It is very time consuming, and it is a lot of courageous conversations that come from my own vulnerabilities, and just think that staff feel safe, and we just have these courageous conversations often.
you know, building again off what Daniel mentioned earlier, that support system, how that inverted pyramid, that you are now supporting your staff and leading by example, in the sense of, yeah, I'm being vulnerable with you and opening my heart and arms and welcoming you in, and then to be a part of that system day in, day out. You live it, and essentially then your students pick up on it and are part of that too. So extremely powerful, and really take away that role versus responsibility of the principal. I think that's a really nuanced way of looking at it, and hugely powerful for our listeners. So thank you. Just shifting gears a little bit on land-based learning within the context of Nipissing First Nation, and I'm really interested to hear around the challenges or conflicts in and around what you want to do and are doing.
I don't believe there's going to be, we're not facing very many conflicts. I think we are facing substantial amount of challenge. We understand that, you know, the relationship between us and Canada is complex, that there are multiple layers in that relationship that we have to acknowledge on both sides. However, what's important to understand is, again, like I said early on, is when organizations come to Nipissing, we are not necessarily bound by the same structural confines that, you know, Canadians have within their organizations. So the idea of, you know, the federal government leading to provincial government, leading to policies and procedures, organizations like OFIA, and then upper organizations or broader organizations like PHE Canada, those structures don't necessarily apply to us. So what happens is we have to understand that when we build a relationship with you, we understand that you have your structures and you have your procedures, and we respect that. What often isn't understood is that we have our own processes and procedures, and sometimes it is not about us integrating into others, it's about others integrating into us. And as we reassert our jurisdiction and as we become more and more independent and more sovereign, it is important to recognize that within the quote unquote traditional boundaries of Canada, which is a misnomer nonetheless, there are Indigenous nations who have their sovereignty in their own right. And those borders aren't necessarily drawn on a map as a strict line. They are layers to access territory. And as Canadian organizations work through those layers, they need to understand that those relationships are unique. Those relationships have opportunity. It's just not what the organization may be used to seeing, because we function very differently. So they're like I said, I don't believe it's conflict. It's more challenge in understanding each other's perspective. I always use the situation where, as an Indigenous person who had entered into a very structured organization, the education system, provincial education system, that was a very foreign situation for me. I am used to simply picking up the phone and calling my chief if there's an issue. And my chief, to be quite honest, is the highest public official we have. And the only thing that would be comparable would be either the Queen or Justin Trudeau. And I always say, well, who has their phone numbers in their back pocket from the Canadian perspective? But everybody from Nipissing knows how to get a hold of our chief. So the accessibility piece is really something that is not a challenge, but it is, again, just one of those situations that is very different. So understanding our processes, understanding how we work is very different. It's almost like you have a rule book, you flip it to the end and say, okay, this is how Nipissing functions. Knowing that when you go to another First Nation, you flip to the end again and you create a new section for that First Nation. Those are the types and the complexities of the relationships that exist and have to exist in order for us to work together properly.
Taking kind of the whole conversation today, I'd love to hear around things that you're doing within your First Nation to really highlight those 21st century nuances through a land-based learning perspective for your students.
Going back to the inverted structures that we have, my duty, my responsibility is to maintain our relationships amongst ourselves. Lacy's responsibility is to be an advocate and to work with our students in order to be able to propagate our beliefs and practices. Where it gets a little challenging, Lacy and I have had this conversation a few times, is and like I had mentioned before, it is not up to us to change our way of doing things. So when it comes to things like, and again, my umbrella, my responsibility is in terms of liability, is within the terms of making sure that our teachers maintain their accreditation, to make sure that the school maintains its accreditation. These are my responsibilities. At the same time, Lacy's responsibilities is to ensure that our worldview, our perspective are interpreted through those provincial curricula. So we work with one another, and we have had the conversation of, this is how we've always done it. Now, for us, this is how we've always done it means often that that propagation of information is thousands of years old. And again, this is where my responsibility is going to the organizations and saying, we will not change this practice. We have safety, we have procedures, checks and balances, we have activities that we have been doing for thousands and thousands of years. That cannot stop. At the same time, I have to balance the modern day 21st century litigious sort of world that we live in to ensure that we have organizations and partnerships with people who are influential in order to make those liabilities decrease in situations, because unfortunately bad things do happen to good people. But that doesn't mean that we are going to stop what we do. And again, this is where organizations, when they decide or when they choose to partner with Nipissing First Nation, it is not up to us to change. It is about us having the conversations in order to see how can we sort of create structures and balances and checks and balances to ensure the safety of our people from the 21st century in this regard. Because again, situations may arise and we want to make sure that everybody is safe, not just students, staff, the organization, everybody. And it is important that we look at that from that lens, because the answer is more complicated than simply saying, well, we cannot do this. We have been doing it and we will continue to be doing it. The issue is, how can we work with our partners to ensure the safety of our people from the 21st century? Because again, our systems have a lot of safety, and I use this term quite readily, is we have safety baked into our processes. And that's something that often is overlooked. And now we're bringing light to it.
Yeah, and I would argue that Dan does a fantastic job of, because of his experience in the provincial system, he knows where to go and how to communicate that. And he's very confident in the work that we are doing. And I think for a long time, the things that we did, we didn't have the confidence to showcase, to tell people, to be confident in what we were doing. It was kind of done in I don't want to say isolation, but where Dan's like, no, this is good. We're going to like, no, you are doing it. And he builds our confidence, which, and through multiple ways, through different organizations and through showcasing the school and building our school athletics department in our promotions and our marketing and really he's very, very good at building up our self-esteem, I guess, as a school. And I see great things on the horizon, even like this, right? This opportunity to share and to do it in a way that we are confident and it is different. And that's okay.
Lacy, you mentioned their self-esteem. Really interested, as you mentioned before, you have non-Indigenous educators in your school, and many of our listeners will be non-Indigenous folks. If you wouldn't mind sharing about how you provide confidence into those non-Indigenous folks that come into a First Nation and are teaching, what that roadmap looks like for them, and what is it you do as a school and as a principal to support them?
That's a great question. And Dan and I talk about this quite often. And this is, my passion is really working with new teachers. And the reality is working in a First Nation school, there is a turnover of teachers. And a lot of times they come to our school from the Faculty of Ed right at Nipissing, and they are not prepared for our learning environment. And for the longest time, I felt like we were different in a less academic way, but we're different in a really good way. And that I think is a shift that's happened with Dan being there, understanding that our minimum standard is OCT. We expect more than that. There's a level of learning that needs to happen beyond what they've learned in the Faculty of Ed. And I wish every single person in the Faculty of Ed could come through our school just to experience our school. It is different, and they have to have an understanding of what our children have been through and an understanding of the impacts of colonization and the intergenerational trauma. Like, it is essential. So a lot of the work that I do with the new teachers is with them and their understanding and what they've come with, because they really do think that all answers reside in the curriculum. That, I'm just going to follow the curriculum. We're going to do this. It's going to be this. And the reality is, it is not. And I need critical thinkers that come out of the Faculty of Ed that question everything that's in the curriculum, because it is not serving our students the way that it could. Right. So it's really, and with Dan's help, it's helping them fit us into the curriculum, right? Not the other way around. And I think that's been a huge shift that has built our confidence. So when these young new teachers come into the school, I have some great conversations with them about their own experience and in school, because the reality is the majority of students in the Faculty of Ed are white, middle class females. And sometimes they come with a savior complex, basically, right? They're going to come and save us. And the reality is they're not. They're actually doing more damage by having that attitude. So there's a lot of work that has to be done. And I just think if it got done in the Faculty of Ed, then it wouldn't be so much work for me, because the other reality is that there are not enough Indigenous academics. There's not enough Indigenous teachers. So, but the school system's failing them. So it's a chicken and egg situation where they're not successful in school because it's not designed for them to be successful. That's why they're not going to post-secondary. That's why they're not becoming teachers. And it is really very frustrating, but I do see the benefit in addressing it immediately, like right out of the gate, kind of like, let's talk about this. Like, and again, it goes back to those relationships, being vulnerable and allowing them to express how they're feeling. And it's okay to ask questions. And if you feel like, ask me anything. Like, and I always say to them, don't worry, you won't offend me. Just, you know what I mean? Just let's have that conversation. And I also have a great support staff, because we do a lot of that work. So wherever they go, they have someone that they can have those courageous conversations with. And probably my greatest asset at the school are two of my non-Indigenous teachers who have done the work with me. And we have been through the trenches together and done some hard work understanding systemic racism and how we are all part of it. And sometimes that's how it's designed for us to not know.
Something you shared there at the end around, we're not meant to know, is Daniel, something you've mentioned before, that this is complex by design. Yeah, just a common theme. I do want to bring the episode together, and although there's so much, and I got pages of notes and so many great things to take away, one thing that's really stuck throughout, and I think a theme in a lot of your answers, was around the inverted pyramid and that support coming the opposite way as such. Director of education sits at the top of the pyramid, or whoever that might be. What you live is the other way around. If you wouldn't mind sharing what that allows and gives you as a school, for your students, for your staff, for your whole community, what that gives you and provides you as a community, staff, school, etc.
I think from a perspective of really how we see social services as a whole, is our duty isn't to create mountains and hills and pyramids in front of our own citizens. Our duty is to fill in the holes and the gaps in which they find themselves walking on when they tread on Mother Earth. If we can have people walk on a flat plane, they can make the world what they wish. They can make their life what they wish. But if we create holes and boundaries and obstacles in their way, we're not serving anybody. It's one of the tenets I know that when I was a band counselor, I kept very dear to me, was my responsibility to the people when they make those choices, when they make that choice to put me in that seat. It's no different as a director of education. The nation made that choice to choose me to sit in that seat, meaning my responsibility is to fill in as much of the whole as possible to support Lacy, to support the school, to support the system we find ourselves in, to support the nation, and ultimately so that our citizens can walk across Mother Earth on a flat, level playing field with everybody else. With, as Lacy mentioned, the confidence to know that what they have is justified. Because for too long, our relationship with Canada has been about demonizing who we are, devaluing who we are. And if we are going to instill that confidence, instill that value system into our own people, that means we have to fill in those potholes. We have to fill in those places. And again, I'm quite fortunate that I do act as a support structure, but it makes my life very easy when we have great support structures like Lacy at the next level up, to allow the teachers the next level up to support the students who choose our school system to be educated. And again, when it comes to academia, our academics are just as rigorous, if not more rigorous, than what is in the curricula. Again, as Lacy said, the curricula is the minimum standard we use, but we expect way more out of what is taught and what is learned. Because again, we are like Canada's industrial model. It is about creating good Canadian citizens at the end of grade 12, while for our model, it's about creating good Anishinaabe people at the end of grade 12. So the goals are very parallel, but they are very different. And again, this is a theme we see in a lot of our relationships, the two-row belt, the covenant chain belt, all these relationships. This isn't a new concept. This is just an extension of these very old relationships that are already in existence and continue to exist to this day.
Brilliant. Thank you. I just want to offer the space as we finish up here, if there's any last messages, anything you'd like to share or say.
I'd like to say that, if I could offer any type of advice to non-Indigenous educators and specific to land-based learning, I would challenge you to really look at the concept of land as pedagogy and frame everything you do under that umbrella. And if you can't see that connection, then there's a lot of work that needs to happen within yourselves. The work has to happen with individuals who have to see that it is essential for Indigenous people to be on the land, connected to the land, in order for them to be successful. There is no end to it. It is ongoing. It is their life. It will be forever. And looking at our responsibility as teachers is to do the work. And it is hard work, and it is ongoing work, and it is not easy. However, it is an investment in making the world a better place.
I have to agree 100%. As a teacher who was with the provincial system for 20 years, there is a lot of professional development that needs to occur, but there is also a lot of personal growth that has to happen. teachers are really great at teaching what they were good at. And that is as much as an advantage as it is a problem. And it is important for us to feel uncomfortable. It is uncomfortable for an Indigenous teacher to teach curricula in a way that is not within a system, especially bigger schools where, courses are established and there are procedures and worksheets ready to roll. It is difficult for Indigenous teachers to teach in that methodology. And I think part of it is to allow the system to be vulnerable, to allow us to understand that we are there as well, and we have a world perspective that is different, valid, and should be honored and respected. Because we've always been around, we've always been here, and understand that Canada is a new player on this territory. And territory and land is pedagogy, is a very deep seated internal, almost, it is spiritual in many regards, but that's what teaching is. A lot of teachers will tell you, I had a calling to become a teacher. This is our calling. We know what it is. It's land is pedagogy. I think that Lacy framed that so perfectly. That is quite literally what we do at Nbisiing. It is what we will continue to do because it is what we've always done.
Can't thank you enough. And I think that brings everything with the discussion and the episode together absolutely brilliantly. I'm so fortunate to be able to have this conversation with the two of you, and I can't wait for our listeners to engage in the topic and learn from this conversation too. So much to unpack and so much to learn. Thank you so much for your time and for your knowledge, and really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Miigwech.
Miigwech.
I want to express my heartfelt gratitude for the wisdom shared by Daniel and Lacy. The richness of their traditions, connection to the land, and the depth of their teachings leave me with an incredible amount to reflect and learn from. Thank you for joining us on this meaningful exploration. Until we meet again, may the echoes of these teachings resonate in your continued connection with the land.